I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person, but I'm there in spirit. So I'm in Singapore, so 12 hours ahead of everyone else. So it's quite late at night. Like Marshall and Jeff, I think a lot of you know, my research has been focused almost exclusively on platform businesses, and I've done so for the better part of actually more than 2 decades now. I imagine that Marshall and Jeff have already told you why platforms are important, so I don't need to repeat that. I mean, I think platform businesses, we have this idea that platform businesses have an outside influence in terms of their value and their power, both in the business world, but I guess also on society. So Marshall does super interesting work these days on free speech versus misinformation, which is just one of many examples of how platforms affect, the world beyond business. Now, like many people here, like many of my colleagues and others who have presented today, I've done a fair amount of consulting based on my research. So in my case, I do applied theory. And I have to say there's something pretty exciting and pretty fun in coming up with frameworks. And in fact, taking the frameworks that I've developed in my academic research and then bringing them to companies to help them frame and hopefully get some answers to real strategy problems, so platform strategy problems. And again, this was fun. And of course, in reverse, working with companies and doing consulting has always proven fairly helpful in my research, in the sense that work with a company, you realize nuances of the concept, the concept of platforms that I had, or platform strategy issues that I had in mind. And then you refine those, just by contact with these companies, and then you bring them back and you realize, okay, well, there's something here that was specific to this context, but actually it's a more generalizable issue, and it raises some interesting problems that people hadn't looked at. So again, there's this very nice back and forth between consulting and research, and this has been fun for a while now. I think we all know, and some people have hinted, that presented before me have hinted at this. I mean, consulting does have limitations. Typically, in our case as academics, it takes the form of, you deliver a lecture, or you do maybe an executive training course, sometimes customized, you talk to the companies, you do some brainstorming sessions, but ultimately you're basically leaving it up to company and its managers to decide about execution. We're not really involved in execution, which, again, in some cases, actually so much for the better. Like, I personally find it particularly exciting to think about the conceptual piece, the strategy piece. I am less good and probably less keen on the execution side. Now, the reason I say this, or the reason I'm now very aware of the limitations of consulting, is because I've actually found a much more exhilarating way to leverage my research, and that is to actually use it to guide my own angel investing decisions. So my co-author was based in Singapore. I'm working with him these days. So about 4 or 5 years ago, we started actually angel investing in startups, most of them platform businesses. And we started taking seriously the idea that, we have this research on platforms. We feel like we understand something about platforms that maybe other people don't. And we decided to put that to the test in a way that I would say is much more, makes much more contact with the reality than simply doing consulting. So at this point, I think we've invested in more than 150 startups, and we've probably looked at thousands of startups, most of them platforms, or let's say platforms adjacent. And I have to say that I've learned a lot in doing so. It's definitely more exciting than doing consulting, especially because you're doing consulting typically for large companies versus angel investing. We're looking at, we'll get to analyze the, potential platforms of tomorrow or of 5 years from now, which is just inherently very exciting. So you see all these passionate entrepreneurs that are trying to do something that will change the world, a few years from now. And it's very hard. And it's especially hard to figure out, it's especially hard to take one's research and say, well, how can I use my research to inform investment decisions? How can I use my research to figure out which of these platforms, which on paper, they all look super interesting, fascinating, which ones do we think have a better chance of survival than others? And I've certainly learned a lot of humility, by the way, in doing this. In particular, I think it was very useful to understand where my research applies and where it's helpful, and where, there are limits, where actually it's not that useful, and, you have to basically you have to use something else, or like just admit that, I can't really tell. So I just want to make a few quick points, things that I've learned, and things that are quite important. So the first thing, where has my research been particularly useful? I thought it was most effective where we leverage it in evaluating the defensibility of certain businesses. Whenever you're investing in startups, I mean, you realize pretty quickly one of the most important questions to ask is, well, how defensible is this business? Of course, there's, will they make it? In a sense, will they find product market fit? Will they solve the chicken and egg problem for marketplaces or platforms? But fundamentally, like one of the most critical questions is, if this is a good idea, there's going to be a lot of competitors. Do I believe that this business, this particular startup, is defensible? And this is a fascinating, a very rich question in the presence of network effects. And one thing we quickly realized is that just saying, oh, there are network effects and therefore this is defensible, is absolutely insufficient. And you have to go a lot deeper than that. Again, before that, and I guess a lot of us academics, we always think, well, platforms have network effects, therefore they're much more defensible than other businesses. Yes, but there are hundreds of platforms. This is what I've learned again in angel investing. There's hundreds of platforms being created every month or every year at least. And most of them will actually fail. And most of them will fail just because, honestly, because they're not very defensible, or the network effects are not very strong. So it's important to have, a pretty comprehensive, pretty good intuition of, what exactly makes some network effects stronger than others, or some network effects more defensible than others. And this is where I feel like I've learned a lot just by evaluating these companies. I had some ideas, based on our research, that again, not all network effects are created equal. But you have to go pretty far and pretty deep in like understanding the nuances of network effects, understanding how they differ from business to business, when exactly can they confer a sustainable competitive advantage, and when they do not. And again, you probably can do some of that with consulting, but having your own money at stake when you're investing is a very good disciplining device. The other part where I found research, my own research, to be very useful in terms of investing is in figuring out, or at least trying to evaluate, potential upside. So in particular, when looking at companies that say start with products and then eventually have the potential to become platforms. So the question there is, okay, we know most startups will fail, but the whole point of investing in startups is that there is a probability, sometimes very, very small, but not zero, that there's a huge upside. That if everything goes well, this is going to be a massive business. This is going to be something like, I don't know, maybe like Facebook or Airbnb or something like that. That's basically what we're looking for. And I think this is where I found my academic research to be particularly helpful, is in trying to be disciplined and trying to say, okay, what exactly is the best case scenario? So that's the upside for this particular startup. Now, on the other hand, I realize I only have, Paul, can you tell me, I think I have 1 or 2 minutes left, right?
A minute and a half.
A minute and a half, perfect. So I just want to make one last point. So on the flip side, I think it's very, and I'm sure like people in the audience realize this very quickly. I also realized that there's a million things that matter for investing decisions, which are absolutely not covered by my research, or honestly by any academic's research. And I've had to learn quite a bit about other aspects. So in particular, for example, if you're angel investing, you have to worry about the quality of the team, how good the founder is, how driven they are they good at advertising or at marketing? There's lots of things which are relatively hard to evaluate, which obviously can make the difference between failure and success. However, I think the way I rationalize this to myself is to say, okay, over 100 or whatever, 150 startups, the founder, team effect, all these things that I'm not very good at evaluating, maybe these things will average out. And hopefully, if my research is good enough and it's rigorous, it will actually, like, what remains is going to be a sufficiently large difference that's going to make this worthwhile. Still too early to tell, but it's certainly, I think it was definitely worth the risk. I feel like it certainly forced me to go a lot deeper into the research than I otherwise would have. So let me stop here and see if there's any questions.
Okay, thanks. So I'll start with one question, then maybe I'll turn it out to the audience. So be thinking about what a question would be. All right, so what are some of the key platform-related trends or developments that angel investors should be paying attention to when evaluating investment opportunities?
So there's some big one. I mean, so first of all, I think at this point, the quote unquote, the secret is out. I mean, everybody understands that platforms can be very powerful. So, I mean, at this point, there's a platform for everything. I think a lot more consumer facing. So I still think there's a lot, like hundreds of opportunities of B2B platforms. So I think that's one. Maybe Jeff had probably talked about this. The second one is obviously new technology. So I think this is like Web3, blockchain technologies. There's a very interesting trends in which these new technologies will probably have the effect of taking away some of the traditional power that platforms have. So it's very interesting to ask, will we see platforms that will dominate just like the traditional Web2 platforms have dominated before in a world of Web3, which by definition makes it easier for people to switch from one platform to another, take their identity, maybe take their content or whatever, their products from one platform to the next. So I think that's a very big trend to follow.
Great. Questions from the audience? Okay, I'm going to give you a question, Andrei. So I think particularly as we shift from, because you mentioned product orientation, but particularly as we think about products that are digital versus ones that are more physical, or the combination of two, that was a little bit what we heard from Jeff. Winner-take-all dynamics decrease, right? We may see more complicated things. So how has your own thinking changed as you start to see more of these physical product, these more complex, again, thinking about Jeff, how's that thinking shifted, and how might you think about your investments decisions shifting over the last 5 to 6 years based on these kind of new phenomena?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think like a big shift that I've observed in myself, and it's certainly how I think about it now. I think initially when I started, it was this thing where like, I really want to identify the next Facebook, the next Airbnb, the next Uber, basically like a winner take all platforms. The more you do this, you realize the probability of winner take all is very low. I honestly think like going forward is going to be very like true winner take all where someone has like 90% market share of a product. I think that's very difficult. But that still means like platforms can still be very valuable. And in fact, what I do now, instead of looking for these like massive winner take all, I'm actually looking exactly for this, like something like typically I prefer to see platforms that are B2B and that are not purely digital. Like ideally something that's B2B that crosses the border between digital and physical, frankly, because they're harder to build. And that by itself creates a competitive advantage. I mean, it's more work. It's not, I mean, to some degree, it's not as scalable. It's certainly not as scalable as the pure software ones or pure internet ones. But ultimately, I think there's more upside to some of these opportunities. So it's kind of interesting, you get into this game because, well, you believe platforms create massive upside. But then I realize, again, winner take all is it's a fool's errand. So you might as well look for platforms that can dominate very well defined like specific verticals and can be very defensible in those verticals.
Okay, and this question just in from the web. Share trends on social, so I think I don't have a full context of the question here. Share trends on social impact civic platforms. So I think that framed around, we're starting to see a lot more places where people share information around social justice, civic issues. Are you seeing anything in that space as a?
So honestly, this is not a space that I'll be very honest. I haven't. I mean, maybe because I haven't seen or I haven't looked specifically for platforms like this. I mean, there's definitely like a lot of platforms that have this flavor of share, like allowing people to contribute, but not necessarily related to activism or whatever civic. I haven't seen very many. I'm sure there are, but I haven't seen that many.
Probably not a lot of investors quite there yet. So, all right, Andrei, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.